France did not fall in 1940 because its soldiers forgot how to fight. It fell because a whole strategic world, political, military, emotional, and institutional, was broken faster than it could adapt. The shock of the campaign came not only from German speed, but from the speed with which certainty itself disappeared. A country that had tried to build security out of memory discovered that memory could become a trap. A republic that still possessed men, guns, allies, and an empire found itself unable to stop the operational logic of a 6-week disaster. And when the military collapse came, it did not remain military. It invaded politics, morality, legitimacy, and the meaning of France itself. That is why the fall of France still matters. Not because it was a clean story of weakness. It was not. And not because it was a simple story of German superiority. It was not that either. It matters because 6 weeks were enough to shatter one of Europe's great powers, transform the Second World War, and convince much of the world that the age of liberal parliamentary civilization might already be ending. To understand why France collapsed so quickly in 1940, you have to begin long before May. You have to begin in the memory of 1914 and 1918, when whole regions of northern France were shattered, an entire generation was maimed, and victory itself felt less like triumph than survival purchased at a grotesque cost. The French state that entered the interwar years was not lazy or unserious. It was traumatized, defensive, and determined never again to bleed white in open battle against Germany. That determination shaped doctrine, politics, alliances, and the emotional rhythm of the Republic. Every debate about security was haunted by the trenches. Every budget argument carried the shadow of Verdun. When officials built concrete, planned mobilization, and trusted static defense, they were not acting irrationally in a vacuum. They were answering the last war with the instruments that last war had made feel morally urgent. French families who had buried sons in the millions did not dream of another offensive crusade. They wanted warning, time, coalition strength, and defensive depth. The state gave them exactly that promise. The tragedy was that by 1940 the promise still felt reassuring even as the battlefield had changed beneath it. This is where the story really begins. France did not fall because it had forgotten war. It fell in part because it remembered the wrong war too well. And this is where the campaign stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. The Third Republic also entered the late 1930s carrying political fragility that military historians sometimes understate. Cabinets rose and fell. Coalition governments were brittle. Ideological conflict sharpened after the Great Depression, after the riots of 1934, after the Popular Front, after the Spanish Civil War, and after the repeated demonstration that Europe was moving faster than parliamentary stability. None of this meant France was doomed. Democratic states can fight hard and fight well. But it did mean that by the eve of war, French confidence in its own political system had thinned. The country was divided not only by class and party but by competing stories about modernity, order, social justice, fascism, communism, and the meaning of national decline. The army was respected, but not always trusted. The left feared reaction. The right feared national softness and internal rot. Industrial mobilization improved, but too slowly and too unevenly to erase years of hesitation. France was not collapsing internally before 1940, yet it was carrying more doubt than the clean image of a united great power suggests. That doubt mattered when shock arrived. Societies do not experience military defeat only through maps. They experience it through the pre-existing confidence or distrust they already feel toward their own rulers. France in 1940 did not enter catastrophe with a full reservoir of political faith. The result was a state that still had enormous resources, a formidable empire, and brave soldiers, but a thinner margin for absorbing surprise than its leaders liked to admit. What mattered next was not only force, but the speed with which force changed perception. French doctrine in the 1930s is often mocked as static, unimaginative, and trapped in the trench mentality. That is too easy. French planners understood mechanization, artillery, and air power better than caricature allows. The problem was not simple stupidity. It was the way logic had hardened around a certain conception of modern war. The French wanted methodical battle. They wanted carefully prepared fire, controlled tempo, clear lines of command, and the deliberate use of superior resources once mobilization was complete. They believed that Germany could be contained, that Allied manpower and economic depth would eventually prevail, and that the first duty of command was to avoid being drawn into reckless improvisation. This approach made sense if the coming war resembled a heavy industrial struggle in which time favored the coalition with deeper reserves. It made less sense if an enemy could shatter tempo, seize operational initiative, and turn uncertainty itself into a weapon. German commanders were not invincible geniuses, but they were far more willing to exploit speed, radio coordination, decentralized initiative, and concentrated armored thrusts in ways that made methodical response slow enough to be fatal. French officers did not wake up in May 1940 planning to lose. They believed they were preserving national strength by refusing fantasy. What they could not see clearly enough was that the enemy's fantasy had already become method. When the campaign opened, doctrine would not merely guide decisions. It would shape what commanders could emotionally accept as possible. By now the war was no longer unfolding according to anyone's peacetime language. No symbol carries more weight in popular memory than the Maginot Line. It has become shorthand for defensive stupidity, for fighting the previous war, for trusting concrete over imagination. Yet the real line was more complex than the myth. It was not intended to defend every inch of the frontier by itself. It was meant to anchor mobilization, protect key sectors, conserve manpower, and channel a German advance into areas where France and its allies expected to meet it. In that sense, the line worked as designed in the sectors where it was strongest. The larger issue was psychological. The line encouraged a habit of thought in which security felt spatially manageable. Risk seemed containable. Time seemed available. The frontier looked as if it could be organized into predictable sectors, and the army's operational imagination adapted accordingly. The unfinished and weaker defenses through the Ardennes and farther north reflected budget, geography, and assumptions about where a massive mechanized thrust was likely or unlikely. French planners did not believe the Ardennes were literally impassable. They believed they were operationally poor terrain for the kind of decisive armored breakthrough that would define the campaign. That judgment, not the concrete alone, was the true disaster. There is a reason the Maginot myth survives. It tells a moral story people find satisfying. But the deeper story is harder. France was not hypnotized by walls. It was reassured by a whole strategic culture in which walls, plans, alliances, and mobilization all fit together too neatly. The German army would not defeat a line. It would defeat the mental world in which the line made sense. The next development would make the previous one look almost preliminary. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain and France declared war, the Western Front did not erupt into immediate catastrophe. Instead came the long strange season later called the phony war. Armies mobilized. Civilians prepared. Leaders spoke the language of total struggle. But month after month, the expected storm did not break in the West. This delay was militarily rational in some respects. France and Britain were not ready for reckless offensive action. Their strategy rested on blockade, economic endurance, and the gradual tightening of superior resources. Yet the silence of the front had side effects. It normalized waiting. It made urgency abstract. It allowed governments and publics alike to imagine that the war might still settle into a familiar pattern of attrition and preparation rather than sudden operational collapse. German propaganda exploited this mood, but the deeper danger was internal. Every uneventful week strengthened the sense that time still existed in useful quantity. The coalition could mobilize more divisions, train more pilots, produce more weapons, and absorb the first blow. The phony war did not make defeat inevitable, but it preserved assumptions that would later encourage the Allies to move north in response to the opening German attack, exactly as German planners hoped they would. Soldiers lived through boredom, cold, and anticlimax. Civilians lived under blackout rules and long anticipation. Ministers lived in a political atmosphere where the war had begun but had not yet become immediate. That kind of suspended tension can be dangerous. It teaches societies to confuse delay with control. When movement finally came, it would feel not only violent but unnatural, because the months before it had taught so many people to expect a slower war. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the collapse was not one mistake but a chain. Germany's eventual operational design was not obvious from the start. Early plans for the Western offensive looked more predictable, more methodical, and in some respects more favorable to Allied expectations. The plan that became famous, the thrust through the Ardennes, across the Meuse near Sedan, and then a dash to the Channel, was the product of debate, revision, chance, and opportunism. The logic behind it was brutal. Rather than simply replaying the broad sweep through Belgium that everyone expected, Germany would use that northern movement partly as bait, drawing Allied forces forward while the real decision was forced farther south through terrain the French considered difficult for a decisive armoured mass. If the crossing succeeded and the armour broke westward fast enough, the Allied armies advancing into Belgium could be severed from the rest of France. This was not magic. It was a hazardous plan that depended on traffic discipline, air support, nerve, local initiative, and the willingness of commanders to keep moving rather than wait for textbook consolidation. If the columns were delayed too badly in the Ardennes, if the Meuse crossings failed, if French counterattack arrived in time, the gamble could become a trap. But the German command accepted risk because it promised not merely battlefield success but operational dislocation on a scale the Allies might struggle even to interpret. This is where one of the enduring myths of 1940 should be corrected. Germany did not win because every officer was a genius and every machine superior. It won because a risky concept was executed in a way that generated paralysis in an enemy whose own doctrine and expectations were badly matched to the tempo being imposed. The campaign would not be decided by metal alone. It would be decided by time, nerve, and the collapse of the Allied ability to see the battle clearly enough while it was still recoverable. And this is where the campaign stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. On the 10th of May, 1940 the waiting ended. Germany struck simultaneously against the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Airborne troops seized key bridges and fortifications. Columns rolled west. Cities woke to sirens, reports, contradictory rumors, and the sudden conversion of months of tension into movement. For the Allied High Command, much of this opening confirmed what had long been expected. Germany was attacking through the Low Countries, and the response was to execute the Dial Plan, move the best French armies and the British Expeditionary Force into Belgium to meet the advance as far east as possible. This had both strategic and political logic. Belgium's fields and roads were preferable battle terrain to the interior of France, and abandoning Belgium too quickly would have been a diplomatic and moral disaster. The problem was not that the Allies moved north. The problem was that the northern attack, though real, was also helping create the conditions for the deeper operational cut. As Allied strength surged into Belgium, German armor in the Ardennes pressed through forests and narrow roads in dense columns whose very vulnerability mattered less than their speed. The front was becoming geometrically dangerous before the Allied command fully understood which geometry mattered most. For civilians in Belgium and northern France, the opening days brought immediate terror, refugee streams, bombing, collapsing communications, and the ancient feeling that a border can stop being legal language and become physical chaos in a morning. For many Allied soldiers, meanwhile, the first phase still felt like the war they had prepared for. That was the trap. The campaign's decisive movement was already forming elsewhere. The offensive looked familiar enough to prompt the expected response. That familiarity was the German plan's greatest early weapon. What mattered next was not only force, but the speed with which force changed perception. The Ardennes did not resemble the obvious avenue for a war-winning armored blow. Dense forests, difficult roads, bottlenecks, and the sheer problem of moving huge numbers of vehicles through constricted terrain made the region look like a place where a major advance could be delayed, exposed, and disorganized. French planners were not delusional for thinking this. They were wrong because the Germans accepted the risks they assumed would deter a rational enemy. As German columns poured through the Ardennes, the operational problem became one of perception. Reports came in. Some officers grasped the scale of the movement more quickly than others. But friction, disbelief, and command culture slowed reaction. In a system trained for methodical battle, alarming reports from a supposedly secondary sector could still be interpreted as exaggerated or temporary. The mind resists information that breaks its map. Meanwhile, the traffic miracle, or nightmare, depending on perspective, kept unfolding. German units jammed roads in astonishing density. Aircraft overhead, staff work, field discipline, and luck kept the movement from collapsing into self-strangulation. Had French air power or artillery coordination been more concentrated and timely, the columns might have paid dearly. But the response was too fragmented, too hesitant, and too poorly synchronized with the actual tempo of German movement. This is one of the cruel facts of 1940. Opportunities existed, but opportunities in war are not enough. They must be recognized, believed, and acted upon before they expire. The French command system was not empty of intelligence. It was too slow to metabolize intelligence that demanded a different emotional grammar of action. By the time the scale of the danger became harder to deny, the Germans were already approaching the Meuse, and the campaign's decisive window had narrowed to days. By now the war was no longer unfolding according to anyone's peacetime language. Sedan became the place where possibility turned into breach. Here, on the Meuse, German forces needed to force crossings, survive French fire, establish bridgeheads, and then push armor across fast enough to prevent the defenders from stabilizing the front. If they failed here, the whole operational gamble could still unravel. French defenses in the sector were not negligible, but they were brittle, second-line formations, incomplete fortification logic, uneven morale, and command assumptions that did not fit the intensity of the coming assault. German air power, especially concentrated bombing and psychological shock, played a crucial role in breaking cohesion. The actual physical destruction from bombing has sometimes been overstated in popular retellings, but the moral effect was immense. Soldiers and officers alike experienced not merely attack but the sensation that the battlefield's old sequence had been shattered. Once crossings were secured and the French line began to crack, the Germans exploited relentlessly. The key was not simply winning at Sedan. It was refusing to let success pause. Tanks, motorized units, engineers, and follow-on formations pressed westward. French counterattacks existed and in some cases struck hard, but they were piecemeal compared with the operational momentum Germany had generated. The Allies were not merely losing ground. They were losing the ability to define where the main battle now was. Sedan became synonymous with collapse in the French imagination because it condensed everything terrifying about 1940 into one operational wound: shock from the air, confusion at the front, breakdown of confidence, and the sickening realization that what was happening was not a local setback but the opening of the body. After Sedan, the campaign changed character. The issue was no longer whether Germany had achieved surprise. It was whether the Allies could recover coherence before the German armor reached the sea. The next development would make the previous one look almost preliminary. What followed was among the most decisive operational movements of the 20th century. German armored forces surged west and northwest with extraordinary speed, exploiting confusion, broken communications, and the widening gap between Allied intentions and battlefield reality. For the Allies, the danger was existential at the operational level. The best French armies and the British Expeditionary Force were still committed far to the north. If the German thrust reached the Channel, those forces could be cut off from the rest of France, trapped in a shrinking pocket with their lines of communication severed. The campaign would not need a Verdun. It would require only a successful amputation. Town after town fell behind or around the spearheads. Staff maps became obsolete almost as soon as they were marked. Commanders tried to improvise counterstrokes, but the sequence of movement favored the Germans. Some local actions were fierce and capable. British and French troops fought hard in many places. But hard fighting in fragments cannot always repair a broken operational picture. By the 20th of May, German forces reached the Channel near Abbeville, and the trap had effectively been sprung. This moment was psychologically devastating because it overturned the scale at which Allied leaders had been thinking. Armies trained for front lines and sectors now confronted the possibility that the front had become a wound curving behind them. Refugees, wrecked roads, and contradictory orders thickened the sense of unreality. Men still holding their ground bravely could suddenly discover that the ground itself no longer belonged to a coherent battle plan. Once the Channel was reached, the campaign's first act was over. The issue was no longer how to stop the thrust at its point of entry. It was how to save the armies trapped north of it. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the collapse was not one mistake but a chain. Dunkirk occupies a strange place in memory because it was both disaster and deliverance. The German breakthrough had trapped British and large French forces in a northern pocket. Ports were threatened, roads were choked, and the possibility of total capture was real. Yet the evacuation that followed became one of the defining episodes of British national mythology. Operation Dynamo was not a victory in the ordinary military sense. It was a salvage operation under desperate conditions. The British Expeditionary Force and many French troops had to be lifted from beaches and harbour moles under air attack, artillery threat, and the steady tightening of the German grip. Equipment was abandoned in staggering quantities. Guns, vehicles, stores, and much of the material basis of an army were left behind. And yet the evacuation succeeded beyond what many had thought possible. Hundreds of thousands were rescued. Naval organization, civilian craft, weather, German hesitation, hard fighting by rearguard units, and the particular geography of the coast all contributed to the result. The famous halt order and subsequent operational choices by the German side have been argued over endlessly, but whatever the exact weight of each factor, one truth remains: the BEF survived as an army in men even if not in equipment. For Britain this became the foundation of endurance. Annihilation had been avoided. The island could still fight on. But from the French perspective the meaning was more painful. Dunkirk saved a crucial ally while confirming that the wider campaign had gone catastrophically wrong. French troops fought and died in the pocket too, often overshadowed later by the British narrative of rescue. The miracle was real. So was the abandonment felt by many in France. Dunkirk did not reverse the fall of France. It ensured that Britain would continue the war, which in the longer story mattered enormously. But in June 1940, for the French state, the catastrophe was still unfolding southward. And this is where the campaign stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. Military collapse was intensified by crisis at the top. French command arrangements had never been simple, and the pace of the German offensive exposed every weakness in the chain. General Maurice Gamelin lost credibility. Paul Reynaud, the Prime Minister, desperately searched for vigor, clarity, and possible salvation. General Maxim Weygand was brought in amid hopes that a new mind could restore coherence. Such changes can sometimes revitalize a campaign. In 1940 they came too late and under conditions too extreme. Weygand's efforts to rebuild a continuous front and organize counterattack had an internal logic, but they required time, order, and troops capable of executing a synchronized concept under conditions where all three were in short supply. Political leadership, meanwhile, was split between those who still wanted to continue the struggle and those who increasingly believed that further resistance meant only meaningless destruction. Messages flew between ministers, generals, London, and provincial authorities. Some looked to imperial resources and the fleet and wondered whether the war might be continued from North Africa if metropolitan France became untenable. Others saw such ideas as fantasy or betrayal of the homeland. Defeat has a tempo all its own, and in France that tempo invaded the cabinet room. Questions that should have belonged to strategy became questions of legitimacy, honor, and what counted as preserving the nation. This is where the story ceases to be purely operational and becomes existential. When a state is moving toward defeat, leaders are not only deciding where to place divisions. They are deciding what kind of memory they can bear leaving behind. Continue the fight and risk civil fracture, occupation without armistice, perhaps the total destruction of cities? Seek terms and risk immortal shame? Such choices are made in hours, but they are haunted for generations. The French political class entered June 1940 not simply with a military problem but with a problem of national meaning. Germany had broken the front. The question now was what France still was if the war on French soil was being lost. What mattered next was not only force, but the speed with which force changed perception. The campaign's second phase, often called full rot, began after the northern encirclement and evacuation crises had passed their decisive moment. If the first phase had shattered the operational framework in Belgium and northern France, the second would decide whether the remainder of the French army could make a stable stand south of the Somme and Aisne. France still possessed men, material, and territory. The country had not ceased to exist because the north had been torn open. But its ability to fight had been badly damaged. Refugee movements clogged roads. Air superiority belonged increasingly to the Germans. Morale had suffered. Units had been mauled, displaced, or improvised. Command transitions had reduced confidence. The problem was not that there was literally no army left. It was that what remained had to fight inside a strategic environment already poisoned by defeat. German forces renewed the offensive in early June. Crossings were forced. Fronts buckled. Local resistance could be determined, even ferocious, but the cumulative effect still favored the attacker. The French army was no longer merely contesting a breakthrough. It was attempting to preserve state existence under conditions of shrinking operational possibility. Paris, which had once been the political heart of national endurance, became increasingly indefensible as a military position. For civilians, the second phase deepened the trauma into something national and migratory. Roads filled with columns of refugees moving south or west, carts and automobiles packed with possessions, children, mattresses, and the stunned determination of people who no longer knew where safety lay. Bombing and rumor traveled with them. This human tide was not the cause of defeat, but it became one of its most unforgettable textures. By mid-June, the campaign's outcome was no longer plausibly reversible in metropolitan France. The question was no longer whether France could win. It was what form defeat would take. By now the war was no longer unfolding according to anyone's peacetime language. Declaring Paris an open city was an act of military realism and symbolic devastation. French authorities understood that defending the capital street by street would likely produce destruction without altering the campaign's outcome. Yet the surrender of Paris without urban battle carried enormous emotional weight. A city long imagined as the heart of civilization, revolution, republic, and national grandeur was now being yielded to the enemy. For the Germans, entry into Paris was not only strategic success but theater. Occupying the French capital completed the humiliation of 1918 in visual form. For the French, the loss intensified the argument over whether continuing the war made sense. The state was no longer merely falling back from frontier zones. It was losing its capital, its communications, and with them much of the moral architecture through which republics understand themselves. The government fled south. German troops entered Paris on the 14th of June, 1940. Photographs and film of marching columns, empty boulevards, and swastikas over French landmarks entered memory immediately. Such images matter in modern war because they condense defeat into a single glance. One can debate doctrine and command forever, a flag over a capital needs no footnote. Yet even here the picture was more layered than pure symbolism. Many Parisians stayed. Some watched in numb silence. Others concentrated on immediate survival. Occupation does not begin as pure abstract shame. It begins with food, curfew, transport, fear, bewilderment, and the creeping recognition that daily life will now be lived under a foreign gaze. The fall of Paris made armistice politics far more powerful, because it told the country in one image that the old war for metropolitan recovery had already been lost. The next development would make the previous one look almost preliminary. Marshal Philippe Pétain now emerged as the central political figure of surrender. Revered for Verdun, elderly, austere, and saturated with the moral prestige of the First World War, he offered something many exhausted French citizens and officials desperately wanted: the language of protection through acceptance. To Pétain and those increasingly around him, continuing the war looked like madness. The army in France was broken. Civilian suffering was immense. Britain's future was uncertain. The empire existed, yes, but the transfer of government and war-making to North Africa seemed to them unrealistic, divisive, perhaps even illegitimate. Better, they believed, to seek terms, preserve what could be preserved, and spare France worse destruction. Against this stood figures like Charles de Gaulle, then still marginal in power but not in historical significance, who insisted that France's defeat in the Metropolitan Campaign was not the end of the war unless France chose to make it so. Empire, fleet, and alliance still offered grounds for continuation. De Gaulle's appeal of the 18th of June would later become one of the great founding texts of Free France. But in real time his position was fragile, improvised, and overshadowed by the immense authority Pétain still commanded. This was not simply a contest between cowardice and courage. It was a contest between two understandings of patriotism. One said the nation must preserve bodies and soil even at the price of submission. The other said the nation must preserve sovereignty and honor even if that meant exile, uncertainty, and long struggle. In June 1940, most French elites, institutions, and public emotions moved toward the first understanding. The armistice would therefore not be a mere military technicality. It would become the hinge upon which the moral and political future of France turned. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the collapse was not one mistake but a chain. On the 22nd of June, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany in the forest of Compiègne, in the same railway carriage associated with Germany's humiliation in 1918. The symbolism was merciless and deliberate. Hitler wanted reversal made visible. The terms left France divided. The north and west would be occupied. The south would remain nominally unoccupied under a French government seated in Vichy, though never truly sovereign in any full sense. The fleet remained under French control for the moment, a fact that would soon terrify the British. Prisoners of war remained in German hands. The Republic itself effectively died in the process, replaced by a new authoritarian state that would soon call itself the French state rather than the French Republic. For many contemporaries, the armistice still looked like a grim necessity rather than immediate moral collapse. That is vital to remember. Collaboration did not begin in the French mind as a fully formed creed of disgrace. It began, for many who supported Vichy, in exhaustion, fear of chaos, distrust of the old parliamentary order, and the belief that accommodation might preserve some national substance beneath occupation. Only later would the regime's full character and complicity become clearer in all their ugliness. Defeat on this scale does not arrive in one moral color. It arrives as relief for some, grief for others, vindication for reactionaries, despair for republicans, confusion for soldiers, and calculation for those already preparing to thrive under the new order. France was not one thing in June 1940. It was a country splitting emotionally as it was split territorially. The war had produced not only military defeat but a new political regime born from the interpretation of that defeat. The next struggle would not merely be between France and Germany, but between rival Frances. And this is where the campaign stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. After every great military catastrophe comes the question that seems simple and is anything but, why? Why did France, with a large army, a proud military tradition, strong fortifications, colonial resources, and British support, collapse in 6 weeks? The temptation is always to hunt for one fatal weakness, a line, a general, a lack of spirit, a superior tank. Real answers are harder because real catastrophes are accumulations rather than single causes. French soldiers did not lack courage. Many units fought stubbornly. Some counterattacks were tactically effective. Airmen flew hard under bad conditions. Rearguard actions cost the Germans time and blood. The issue was not national cowardice. It was the mismatch between doctrine, command tempo, communications, strategic expectation, and the operational shock of the German plan. France was not beaten because its people would not fight. It was beaten because its system could not recover once its assumptions were broken faster than its institutions could adapt. German success rested on concentrated armor, radio coordination, flexible initiative, good staff work, surprise in the decisive sector, and the ability to keep exploiting rather than pause. Allied failure rested on underestimating the Ardennes thrust, overcommitting north too early, fragmented air response, command structures too slow for the pace imposed, and political fragility once catastrophe began. None of these factors alone explains everything. Together they explain enough. This is why moralizing accounts of 1940 are so unsatisfying. France was neither decadent stereotype nor blameless victim of unstoppable genius. It was a modern state that made serious choices for understandable reasons and then discovered those reasons no longer matched the battlefield. The result was not just defeat. It was revelation. The campaign became one of the great warnings of modern military history. When a state builds its whole defensive imagination around one kind of war, a different kind of war can destroy not only armies but confidence before adaptation becomes possible. What mattered next was not only force, but the speed with which force changed perception. The fall of France remade the Second World War. Britain now stood alone in Europe against Germany. The balance of continental power changed overnight. The United States watched with a new seriousness, because the possibility that Britain too might fall no longer looked absurd. The Soviet Union, still bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, now faced a Europe in which German military power looked terrifyingly efficient. Hitler's prestige soared. The Wehrmacht appeared nearly unbeatable. Fascism's aura of dynamism and democratic weakness seemed, for a moment, vindicated in the eyes of supporters and fence-sitters across the world. Collaborationist and authoritarian movements elsewhere read France's collapse as proof that parliamentary liberalism was exhausted. Anti-fascists read it as nightmare confirmation that the stakes were now civilizational. For Britain, France's fall meant the Battle of Britain would now be fought with no continental ally still holding a western front. For the French Empire, the armistice created zones of contested loyalty that would matter from Syria to North Africa. For de Gaulle, obscurity turned into vocation. For the United States, rearmament and aid to Britain became harder to resist politically. The campaign that had seemed a regional disaster was already becoming a world event. And in France itself, the consequences entered homes, schools, churches, barracks, rail stations, camps, and kitchens. Occupation, collaboration, resistance, adaptation, hunger, censorship, denunciation, deportation, compromise, and liberation all lay ahead. 6 weeks had ended one world and opened several others at once. That is why the campaign matters so much. It was not merely a spectacular defeat. It was a hinge on which the wider war and much of modern Europe turned. By the time the armistice took effect on the 25th of June, 1940, the campaign had already entered history as more than a military defeat. It had become a judgment on doctrine, on politics, on memory, on the fragility of modern states that mistake preparation for adaptability. Yet the campaign's deepest lesson may be this: defeat can happen long before a society admits that the battlefield has changed. France prepared hard for a war shaped by one terrible memory and encountered a war shaped by another logic. That was the operational tragedy. The political tragedy was what followed, the choice to interpret catastrophe not as a reason to continue the struggle elsewhere, but as permission to bury the Republic beneath the rhetoric of preservation. And yet even here the story refuses neatness. Because from the ruins of June 1940 also came Free France, British endurance, American awakening, imperial reordering, and the eventual Allied return. The campaign did not end the war. It made the war larger, darker, and more global than before. It turned Britain's survival into a world question. It turned de Gaulle into a national symbol. It turned Vichy into a permanent wound in French memory. It warned every democracy that military courage cannot compensate indefinitely for doctrinal rigidity and political exhaustion. And it demonstrated, with terrifying clarity, that modern war can destroy not only armies but the confidence through which nations understand themselves. That is why the fall of France still feels like a shock even to those who know the outcome. It happened too fast for comfort, too intelligently for easy contempt, and with consequences too large to confine to one front or one summer. 6 weeks. That was all it took to remake the war, divide France against itself, and convince an astonished world that the future had become far more dangerous than it had looked in the spring. The fall of France was not just a collapse. It was a warning delivered at continental scale. And Europe never forgot it. There is another reason the campaign continues to fascinate military historians. It is one of the rare moments when operational art appears to overtake political imagination in real time. Politicians and publics can usually narrate a war through frontlines, declarations, and visible battlefields. In May 1940, however, the decisive movement outpaced the language available to explain it. Armies were not simply being pushed back. They were being bypassed, reoriented, severed, and psychologically unmade before many of the actors involved fully grasped what shape the defeat was taking. This created a peculiar fog not of information alone but of interpretation. Men at headquarters had reports. They lacked, at crucial moments, the willingness or capacity to imagine that the reports added up to an operational revolution already in progress. That lag between data and belief is one of the enduring themes of the campaign and one reason it still speaks so directly to modern strategic thought. The human geography of defeat also deserves emphasis. The refugee exodus of 1940 was not simply collateral movement behind the lines. It became part of the event itself, a civilian flood that thickened roads, strained communications, amplified rumor, and deepened the sensation that the state was coming apart in public. To watch columns of civilians pushing south with furniture, livestock, children, and scraps of domestic life was to see war spill entirely beyond the soldiers' world. It was one thing to hear that the line had broken. It was another to stand on a road and watch society itself move past in the form of frightened families who no longer believed any place ahead was certainly safe. These images entered French memory as powerfully as tank thrusts and air attacks because they made defeat social rather than merely strategic. The German side, too, requires demystification. The success of 1940 later fed myths of effortless blitzkrieg, as though German commanders had discovered a frictionless formula and applied it with machine precision. In reality, the campaign involved argument, improvisation, communication failures, genuine risk, road chaos, exposed flanks, and moments when overextension could have been punished far more severely than it was. German success was astonishing, but astonishment should not turn into enchantment. The campaign worked because risk was accepted, tempo preserved, and Allied reaction repeatedly outpaced by the German ability to convert local gains into wider dislocation. It was an extraordinary achievement, but it was still made by human systems operating under uncertainty. France's memory of 1940 would later oscillate between shame and simplification. Some preferred to remember resistance and liberation, pushing the catastrophe itself toward the margins. Others treated 1940 as proof of a national defect, as though 6 weeks revealed an eternal character flaw. Both responses are unsatisfactory. The campaign is better understood as a concentrated historical encounter between trauma, doctrine, politics, leadership, technology, and operational surprise. It reveals not the essence of a people but the vulnerability of institutions that cannot adapt fast enough when their deepest assumptions fail. That is a far more troubling lesson, because institutions everywhere are built on assumptions they rarely test until crisis forces them to. One of the most persistent distortions of 1940 is the idea that the French army simply dissolved from cowardice. That judgment has always been more comforting to later storytellers than accurate to the evidence. French units often fought stubbornly under terrible conditions. Some formations held until they were bypassed. Some artillery positions continued firing after the larger operational picture was already hopeless. Some armored and infantry counterattacks struck with real force, if too little and too late. Rearguards died buying hours that mattered to others. The campaign's tragedy is sharper, not softer, once courage is restored to the picture, because it reveals how thoroughly bravery can be wasted by a command environment no longer matched to events. Men who had done what states asked soldiers to do, hold, move, fire, endure, were still carried backward inside a system that had lost the power to translate sacrifice into strategic recovery. That is why veterans' memory after the war often carried bitterness not only toward Germany or Vichy but toward later myths that made the defeat sound morally simple. To be told that France had not fought was, for many who had fought, a second humiliation. They had fought. What had failed was the machinery above them, the assumptions, communications, timings, allocations, and political confidence required to make fighting cohere into defense. The distinction matters because it rescues the campaign from cheap national psychologizing. France's problem in 1940 was not an absence of military virtue. It was the catastrophic mismatch between that virtue and the system meant to direct it. The British counterattack at Arras has also acquired outsized symbolic importance because it hints at how narrow some of Germany's margins could be. In May 1940, British and French forces struck at the flank of German spearheads in a move that, while limited in scale, briefly alarmed German commanders and fed later debate over whether more concentrated Allied counteraction might have changed the campaign's course. The answer, like so many answers in 1940, is not clean. Arras did not come close to reversing the campaign by itself. But it did reveal something crucial: the German advance, for all its speed and confidence, was not immune to fear, overextension, or uncertainty. Even the victors could glimpse the possibility of losing control. This is historically important because it breaks the spell of inevitability that later memory sometimes casts over the campaign. The Germans were not rolling forward on rails laid by fate. They were taking risks in terrain and tempo that could have gone differently under stronger, faster, better coordinated pressure. That they did not go differently is one of the reasons the campaign became so consequential. But possibility remained real. It flickered and died rather than never existing at all. This is often how modern military disaster works. It is not pure inevitability. It is an accumulation of missed chances so rapid that they only appear fully visible after the outcome has settled. Belgium's surrender late in May added another layer of bitterness to the northern catastrophe. King Leopold III's decision to capitulate while British and French forces were still fighting in the pocket was treated by many Allied observers as betrayal, weakness, or selfishness. Yet the Belgian position was already desperate. The army had been strained severely, the country overrun, and the wider Allied operational picture was disintegrating. The king saw continued resistance as militarily futile and nationally destructive. His critics saw a surrender that worsened the position of others at the worst possible time. Both views contain truth, and the controversy reminds us that coalition warfare under collapse generates moral accusations as quickly as strategic calculations. The Belgian surrender mattered because it sharpened the sense that time was vanishing. Every Allied actor was now making decisions inside a shrinking geography of possibility. Choices that might look selfish in one frame could appear unavoidable in another. The British, determined to save the BEF, naturally privileged evacuation. The French, still trying to preserve state survival, could read British priorities as retreat from shared sacrifice. Smaller allies, facing destruction on their own soil, judged events through the lens of immediate ruin. Coalition war under victory can conceal these diverging perspectives. Coalition war under collapse throws them into cruel focus. Italy's entry into the war on the 10th of June, 1940 further darkened the French position, even if Italian military performance in the Alpine fighting was hardly decisive in the same way as the German campaign. Symbolically, however, Mussolini's declaration mattered enormously. It advertised to the world that France now looked weak enough to be safely attacked by a regime eager for spoils and prestige. It was predation dressed as alliance. For the French, the timing reinforced the sense that defeat was attracting opportunism from every direction, that enemies and opportunists alike could smell vulnerability. This mattered to political morale because it made the war feel larger just as France's ability to shape it was shrinking. If Germany alone had broken the army, perhaps some leaders could still imagine a narrowly military reckoning. But with Italy entering, with Britain evacuating, with the capital lost, with refugees in motion and communications broken, the collapse became continental and psychological at once. Enemies multiplied as agency contracted. Such moments are especially dangerous for democracies because the language of emergency can swiftly become the language of resignation. Military technology itself has often been made to carry too much explanatory weight in the story of 1940. Tanks, radios, aircraft, and doctrine all mattered enormously, but the campaign was not a simple demonstration that one side possessed modern machines and the other did not. The French had serious armor. In some categories of tank design, they had formidable vehicles. The British too were not absent from mechanized war. The deeper issue was operational integration and command philosophy. German armored forces were concentrated and employed to rupture, exploit, and destabilize. Allied armor was often dispersed, parceled out, or conceptually tied to support functions that did not maximize its capacity to generate independent operational shock. This does not mean that all French designers, officers, or doctrines were blind to armored potential. Charles de Gaulle himself argued for concentrated armored formations before the war. Others saw parts of the future clearly enough. But institutions are not transformed by insight alone. Budgets, traditions, interwar politics, prestige structures, and doctrinal habits all stand between a good idea and a national system. By 1940, Germany had done more to align machine, command, and operational intention. France still possessed many of the ingredients of modern war, but not the same recipe, and not the same willingness to let speed itself become the principle of battle. The civilian exodus of 1940 has sometimes been described as if it were merely a tragic byproduct. In reality, it changed the texture of the campaign profoundly. When millions of civilians took to the roads, fleeing bombers, rumor, advancing armies, or simply the fear that no place north of them remained secure, the war's practical environment changed. Roads clogged. Staff cars and military convoys were delayed. Administrative collapse deepened. Rural communities absorbed panicked newcomers. Families were separated and recombined under conditions of exhaustion and misinformation. The Great Movement southward became one of the campaign's most unforgettable social facts. And yet the exodus was not irrational. It was a rational response to the breakdown of trust in the state's ability to define danger. Once civilians no longer believed that authorities could say with confidence which roads were safe, which towns would hold, or where the front even was, movement became its own form of survival. This is politically significant. It marks the point at which military collapse enters daily life as common sense. People move not because they are ordered to, but because they have ceased to believe that staying still under state guidance is safer than improvising on their own. French colonial troops and imperial soldiers are often pushed to the margins of 1940 narrative centered on European collapse, but they belonged fully to the campaign's human reality. Men from North and West Africa fought in French uniform. Colonial subjects participated in the defense of a republic that did not treat them as equals. Their present reminds us that the French war effort was imperial as well as national. Their later treatment under German racism and under selective French memory added another layer of complexity to the defeat. They were asked to defend a state whose universalism had always been compromised, and then they were too often forgotten in the grand national retellings that followed. This matters because the fall of France was never only metropolitan. Its army was broader than the nation-state frame through which later memory often narrates it. Defeat therefore traveled outward through empire, race, and colonial administration. The 1940 catastrophe did not merely divide France from Germany. It redistributed authority and uncertainty across a global imperial system whose subjects were already questioning the moral coherence of European rule. In that sense, the campaign helped accelerate not only the war's next phase but the long weakening of European imperial self-confidence. The legal and administrative details of the armistice mattered more than later cinematic memory sometimes suggests. The armistice did not end French state structures entirely. It rearranged them under conditions of hierarchy, surveillance, and subordination. Occupied and unoccupied zones produced different rhythms of administration and coercion. Prisoners of war remained captive in huge numbers, draining households and communities of men and prolonging defeat into the intimate daily time of waiting and absence. The line between occupied and unoccupied France was not merely cartographic. It reorganized economy, police authority, travel, censorship, and the very practical geography of life. That administrative continuity is part of what made Vichy so dangerous. Because some French institutions remained, many could tell themselves that the nation still existed in a manageable form. Total collapse had been avoided, order had been preserved, a state still functioned. But this was precisely how accommodation deepened. Survival through continuity can become moral anesthesia. It allows a defeated society to continue daily routines while the terms of those routines are increasingly set by domination. The genius and horror of Vichy lay partly in how much of France could keep feeling administratively alive while becoming politically and morally disfigured. The British attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in July 1940 belongs to the afterlife of the campaign and reveals how thoroughly France's defeat had poisoned the alliance. For Britain, the danger was obvious and terrifying. If the French fleet fell under German control, the naval balance could shift in ways that threatened Britain's survival. Churchill's government, determined not to let that happen, offered French commanders limited choices and then opened fire when satisfactory guarantees were not secured. The result was the killing of French sailors by a state that had been France's closest wartime ally only weeks earlier. The emotional and political consequences were enormous. Merzel-Keber demonstrates how quickly military collapse reshapes moral space. Britain believed it was acting from necessity. Many French people experienced the action as treachery piled on humiliation. The incident damaged British standing among those French who might otherwise have drifted more readily toward continued resistance. It also reminded everyone that after June 1940 sentiment could no longer be trusted as strategy. Alliances had entered a phase in which survival overrode memory, ceremony, and recent comradeship. This hardening matters because it shows the wider consequences of the fall of France. Once France ceased to function as Britain's continental partner, British policy toward French assets, territories, and commanders had to be recalculated from first principles. That recalculation was ugly, but it was part of the world June 1940 created. De Gaulle's emergence from the wreckage is one of the most improbable developments of the whole story. In June 1940 he was not yet the giant he would become in later French memory. He was a relatively junior brigadier, intellectually restless, politically marginal, and newly appointed to a minor ministerial role. Yet he possessed two things many larger figures lacked at the crucial moment: conceptual clarity about mechanized war and a refusal to equate defeat in France with the end of France. His appeal from London on the 18th of June did not instantly mobilize a nation. Few heard it live. Fewer still could have guessed it would become foundational. But its historical importance lies precisely in how fragile it was. Against the prestige of Pétain, against the sheer force of defeat, against institutional collapse, de Gaulle asserted a different legitimacy grounded in continuity of war rather than continuity of administration. This matters because the fall of France is not only the story of collapse. It is also the story of what had to be invented in order to refuse collapse. Free France did not arise from a stable apparatus. It arose from exile, stubbornness, British sponsorship, and the gradual accumulation of symbolic weight. Without 1940's defeat there is no Vichy, but also no Gaullist counter-legitimacy in the form it later took. The campaign therefore divided French political memory in ways that would outlast the Second World War itself. Who represented France, the state that stayed, or the authority that left in order to continue the fight? The question became one of the central dramas of modern French history, and it was born directly from the 6-week catastrophe. Another essential aspect of the campaign is the role of communications. Modern war is often described through machines, but machines matter through systems. German radios, mission-style command culture, and the willingness of commanders to exploit fleeting opportunities gave armored units a level of operational fluidity the Allies struggled to match. French command culture tended to be more centralized, more methodical, and less comfortable with rapid initiative once the battle moved beyond expected sequences. This did not mean French officers were dull or passive by nature. It meant the command system had been designed for control, and control becomes an enemy of recovery when events outrun the tempo at which instructions can be issued and verified. Once the front dissolved into movement, centralization carried a cruel price. Orders arrived late. Information became stale. Units that still had fighting power were misused, delayed, or committed into situations already transformed by the time they received instruction. German units, by contrast, could often exploit local success before the enemy had fully processed what had been lost. Here, too, the campaign's warning is broader than 1940. Institutions built for order can become catastrophically slow when they confront a world in which disorder itself is being weaponized. The fall of France was therefore not just a story about tanks crossing rivers. It was a story about organizations encountering time differently, and one of them losing because it could not think as fast as events now demanded. Memory after liberation complicated everything further. Post-war France needed stories through which it could live with 1940, occupation, collaboration, and resistance all at once. The Gaullist narrative emphasized the continuity of the true France through resistance and liberation. Communist memory emphasized sacrifice and anti-fascist struggle. The Vichy episode was often treated for years as aberration, parenthesis, or the work of a corrupted minority rather than as a regime that had drawn on genuine currents within French society. This selective remembering was politically understandable. nations emerging from humiliation rarely begin with total honesty. They begin with survivable stories. But survivable stories leave residues. Over time, historians, filmmakers, journalists, and courts pushed harder against comforting simplifications. Vichy's role in persecution and deportation was reassessed more openly. So too did the courage, fragmentation, and late growth of resistance. In that long struggle over memory, 1940 remained the original wound. The speed of the defeat itself kept demanding explanation because it made every later choice feel at once more understandable and more inescapable. People asked again and again, if the collapse had been so fast, what could anyone reasonably have done? And equally, if alternatives still existed, why were they not chosen more widely? These are not questions history settles once. They are the kind it revisits whenever the relationship between democracy, defeat, and moral compromise has to be reconsidered. There is also the European lesson. The fall of France did not just expose French weaknesses. It exposed how deeply the interwar order had failed to produce a strategic culture equal to the threats gathering against it. Appeasement, delayed rearmament, alliance uncertainty, economic trauma, demographic fear, and the political fragmentation of democracies all formed part of the setting in which 1940 became possible. France carried the heaviest immediate burden because its territory became the decisive battlefield, but the campaign cannot be separated from the wider failure of Europe to contain Nazi Germany before containment required war under the worst possible conditions. In that sense, 1940 was not just French catastrophe. It was the bill for a continental decade of drift, fear, and miscalculation. This is one reason the campaign still resonates beyond military history. It speaks to the problem of how democracies respond to long-building threats that do not feel urgent enough soon enough. It speaks to the temptation to answer one trauma by overlearning its lessons. And it speaks to the way political division can become operational vulnerability without any single moment of treason or collapse beforehand. France in 1940 was not defeated because it had no strategy. It was defeated because the strategy it had built was slightly too reasonable for the war it actually got. That kind of mismatch is always terrifying, because it suggests that serious states can fail not through madness but through the accumulated logic of assumptions that no longer fit reality. Finally, there is the matter of scale. 6 weeks is short enough to feel unreal. The First World War taught Europe to imagine decisive campaigns dissolving in 2 years. Even the early phases of the Second World War had not yet fully destroyed that expectation in the West. The fall of France therefore carried a revelation beyond its immediate military effects. Industrial modern war did not necessarily mean long deadlock. Under the right conditions, it could still produce swift strategic earthquakes. That realization affected every major power that watched. The British saw it and understood that home defense and air defense were now questions of survival. The Soviets saw it and, despite their own intelligence and planning, would later confront a similar shock in 1941. The Americans saw it and absorbed a hard lesson about preparedness, alliance, and the speed with which continental balances can disappear. 6 weeks altered not only the map of Europe but the psychological map of the world. That is perhaps the deepest reason the campaign still grips us. It compresses into one devastating sequence the fragility of confidence, the danger of strategic misfit, the terror of modern tempo, and the political aftershocks of sudden defeat. It is a story of armies, yes, but also of institutions discovering that their margin for error was far thinner than they had believed. And when that discovery came, it came too fast for repair. One of the strangest things about 1940 is that it can still feel surprising even after one knows the end. The maps, the names, the dates, the outcome, these are all familiar. Yet the compression of the catastrophe continues to produce disbelief. France was a victor of the First World War, a great military power, the holder of a global empire, and a pillar of the anti-German coalition. That such a state could be strategically broken in 6 weeks remains unsettling because it suggests that power is often less durable than it looks from the outside. Much of modern history's terror lies in this gap between appearance and endurance. Institutions that seem stable can prove brittle. Fronts that look continuous can be rendered meaningless. Political systems that imagine themselves as rational can discover too late that their rationality was attached to the wrong world. This is why the campaign has never settled into mere antiquarian interest. It belongs to the permanent library of warning. It tells future states that memory is not enough, that courage is not enough, that resources are not enough if doctrine, command, and political confidence no longer match the tempo of events. It tells democratic societies that fragmentation and mistrust matter in war even when they do not look immediately military. And it tells historians that collapse is rarely a single moment. It is the visible culmination of habits, assumptions, and political choices that only look inevitable after the outcome has hardened.